Hello, good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are. Thank you for joining me today for our Construx Lunch and Learn Debunking Kanban Myths and Misconceptions. I'm also joined by my colleagues Earl Beatty and Jesse Bronson. You may hear from them from time to time. Construx has always believed in giving back to our community, and our community is software professionals. In 2009, during the recession, we offered free public seminars to people to join us. In this unprecedented time of 2020, where we now have a lot of our software professionals working from home, we wanted to offer lunch and learn programs. And we wanted to do this for a couple of reasons. The first reason was an opportunity for folks to just take a break from their day-to-day activities, learn something, have a little bit of change of pace. But the second was to really have an opportunity for teams or groups to build a sense of community by joining us together as whole teams or whole groups to observe and watch these lunch and learns and then have a chance to debrief and discuss them afterwards, a way to have an activity for a whole group to discuss in this time where we're a little socially isolated from each other. So these will be continuing throughout all of April, and we encourage you to share these with your friends, with your colleagues, with people in other companies at construx.com/lunch. You can find information and schedules for additional lunch and learns that will be happening through this time. Please feel free to submit your questions at any time. We'll answer questions as we go, so there's no need to wait until the end. Also, unless you would like to pause the session and you're coming in through the web, please don't hit the space bar. That will pause the presentation. So if you do suddenly see that pausing, feel free to just hit the space bar again and it will start up. You can also back up through the presentation. So if you did want to take a second and revisit something that was just said, you can back up through the presentation. The presentation will also be available in Construx on-demand ecosystem a day or so after today. So it's available for you to look at there as well. All right, so this Lunch and Learn is all about Kanban myths and misconceptions. I sometimes joke that Scrum isn't necessarily very well understood or practiced. And if that's true of Scrum, Kanban is significantly less well understood and less well practiced. So I want to talk through some of the myths, and I want to give you a sense of what Kanban really is and can really do to help clear those up. So what are some of those common misconceptions? Kanban's just a board. I have people showing me all the time a little task board to do in process and done and telling me they're doing Kanban. And I want you to know there's so much more to Kanban than that. It's just Scrum without iterations. Well, potentially it could be, but it can also be many other things. There's no estimation in Kanban. Perhaps, again, it doesn't, we'll talk about the fact that you can have things in Kanban depending on what you decide, what you agree, what you set as policies or criteria for your unique Kanban implementation. Often I get asked, should I use Scrum or Kanban? And I always say the answer is really where in the organization does it make sense for you to use Kanban? And some people will say, well, that Kanban thing, that's just too complex. I'm going to take you through the basics of how to set a Kanban system up today, and I hope you'll see that's really not true. So let's talk about what Kanban is. I'll give you a brief overview of it. Then we'll talk about how to set up a Kanban. I'll give you the basic steps of doing that. We'll talk about something called classes of service, which will help you understand if work doesn't necessarily all have the same priority or get treated in the same way, how does Kanban handle that? I'll give you some basics for how to operate a Kanban system, and we'll talk about can Scrum and Kanban coexist? So what is Kanban? Kanban really comes out of the roots of Lean and the Toyota Production System, TPS. The Kanban community will often call Kanban an alternative path to agility, but its roots do come from a different place than maybe Scrum or extreme programming or feature-driven development. Kanban really has its roots in lean manufacturing, just-in-time inventory, looking to really reduce waste and optimize the value delivery to our customers and our clients. Kanban simply means a signal, a sign, or a token. A simple way of thinking about this is a cherry blossom festival in Japan, where to enter the festival, you need to be given a little plastic chit, and you take that chit and you can stay in the festival as long as you want. If you leave, you give them back the little plastic token. If there aren't any more tokens available to hand out to somebody, then nobody else gets to enter the festival until somebody leaves. So the plastic chit is the token, and the Kanban system is the fact that that token is used to control the flow, how many people can be in that festival or not be in that festival. The Kanban method isn't really a unique single thing. It's not like something where it's Scrum, where it comes with events and it comes with artifacts and it comes with roles. It's not a specific workflow. It's not a specific SDLC. What it really is a way of providing additional visibility and information about your current process or your current workflow. So you can Kanban anything. You could Kanban Scrum if you wanted to. You can Kanban the way you work today just to make that much more visual to people so that they understand what you're doing. It's also a big part of Kanban is that you want to really...
I'm just listening.
Earl, I can hear you. I can really manage my workflow and manage my process. So it's a way of visualizing and then really putting in place some policies, some work and process limits, and some other things that help you optimize that value delivery through the system that you have Kanbaned. Another thing that the Kanban community will talk about a lot is it's a facilitator for organizational change. So we don't necessarily introduce any major changes when we bring Kanban in, but we want it to evolutionarily change how we're operating to optimize that value delivery over time. And in fact, you'll see in the foundational principles, the first one is you want to start with what we do now. So we don't introduce anything new when we Kanban unless we as a team sitting down together in our Kanban system design really do say, well, starting tomorrow, we're going to do things slightly differently. And we agree to it, and we agree that tomorrow we will begin doing all those activities. But I Kanban, when I help teams Kanban, we really look at what do you do today now, and I want to make sure that they feel like their Kanban system really reflects how they work day in, day out. But then we agree, we're not going to stop there. We'll start there, but we're not going to stop there. We're going to pursue incremental evolutionary change, preferably metrics-driven evolutionary change until we're really optimizing that flow or that value delivery through our system. So we're not going to change anything related to roles or responsibilities or job titles. If I Kanban a Scrum team, I will not change the product owner role. If I Kanban a team who has an engineering manager who's organizing and prioritizing their work, we're going to keep that there, and we're going to call that person an engineering manager. But I do want everybody in the Kanban system to feel like it is their system and they are a big part of changing that over time. So I want to make sure that it's not just something where the managers define the Kanban system and then they make all the changes over time. I want the individual people working in the Kanban system to feel like they really own that Kanban system and they are part of making that system better and better over time. Kanban has some core practices, and a lot of people think just of the first one, which is visualize. And simply visualizing and putting something on a Kanban board is considered to be shallow Kanban. Now, it's a great first step, but most people stop here and they really leave out the true power of Kanban, which is to go deeper into these core practices. So after I've visualized, I understand my work, I understand how that work moves, I understand the stages it goes through, I want to talk about limiting work in process. And the reason to limit work in process is to optimize that value delivery through the system. And I'll take you through some different ways of limiting work in process when we go through the setting up a Kanban stage. Then I want to manage my flow. I want to make sure that we understand how the work is moving or flowing, and I'll share with you some metrics for doing that. And we're looking to really optimize that flow through our management, through things like making stage policies explicit or board policies explicit, or making experiments on the system that we think will increase or improve the system's ability to deliver. I also want to implement feedback loops. In a perfect Kanban world, that's just going to happen spontaneously. We'll have our daily Kanban meeting and we'll just start talking about things that will help us improve. Sometimes with brand new teams here, I'll really steal from Scrum and say, if you haven't done a process improvement activity in 2 weeks, let's have a Scrum style retrospective. So Kanban's very flexible here, but it does want you to have feedback loops and it wants you to be continuously improving, preferably even faster than the average Scrum team's 2-week retrospective cycle. And finally, at true deep Kanban, we're going to improve in a very collaborative manner, and we're going to do it in a very experimental manner. So we'll have enough data about our system that we can say things like, I believe if we make this change, we'll see our throughput improve by 5% or 2%. So really understanding our system in a deep enough manner that we can actually use metrics and data to really evolve scientifically and experimentally over time. A lot of times people will ask me, well, when should I use Kanban? And there's a lot of great places to use Kanban. I'll use Kanban often when organizations want to start with how they work today. They don't want to introduce major changes. They don't want to bring in something like Scrum with a whole set of new roles, new events, new artifacts. They really want to say, well, let's see how we work today and then incrementally evolve that into a much more agile future. I also find that Kanban works really well when you have a group that either can't plan for a 2-week sprint. I talk about production support teams a lot here. The phone rings today, rings in the next hour. What I do 2 hours from now or this afternoon radically changes because the phone rang or something came in through a ticketing system. And that is just the nature of the work. And so the idea of trying to time box that work really is fighting the nature of the work. And I don't want to do that. Or teams that need to be really, really responsive. I see this a lot where large product development teams will say have a set of feature teams or delivery teams that are working, but there'll be some infrastructure teams or other teams like a test automation tooling team that needs to be more responsive to that feature team than a 2-week cycle. And so rather than being a Scrum team, they're really a Kanban team, so they can support and enable the teams on an ongoing fast-paced basis, depending on what those teams need to deliver in that 2-week cadence. And the last time I'll often use Kanban is when I want to make a good Scrum team great. I can introduce some new metrics, a new way of looking at the work, and really help them transition from doing Scrum well into being a truly, truly agile team with a lot of data and a lot of ability to scientifically evolve and experiment with their flow to improve. So let's get into a few of the nuts and bolts on just how to set up a Kanban. Some of the key things you need to understand are what kind of work flows through the Kanban system. Kanban will call these work item types. So are we doing projects? Are we doing product backlog items? Are we doing releases? What exactly are we delivering? Who wants something and what do we give them? This is usually actually the trickiest thing to understand in Kanban. Once we know the work item types, we talk through the workflow. The workflow is actually relatively simple. It's just a series of and then what happens kind of questions to the work item types. We need to talk about work and process limits. So how are we actually going to optimize our flow? And that's where we turn to the WIP limits to really help us understand what we need in place to optimize value delivery through our system. I want to talk about work state policies, and a lot of times we'll use that for, people will call that exit criteria. What's it mean to actually be done with a piece of work in a stage in the Kanban system? And then we need to talk about, do you need classes of service? And some of the teams that I work with do need a class of service. They have work that is unique in nature. It really does need to be treated differently than other kinds of work. And some teams don't. Some teams just need to order or prioritize their input queue or their product backlog to make sure that they're working on the right things. So up until classes of service, all good Kanban implementations have work item types, work states, WIP limits, but you may or may not need class as a service depending on your situation. So what are these work item types? I usually look for deliverables. So if I've got a Scrum team, that team is most likely delivering product backlog items. I work with a lot of teams who are doing operational work, and some teams there will have examples like we do project work, that's longer term work, bringing something new into the system, and then we do keep the lights on kind of work, just small things to keep the system up and running. So really we're looking at who wants something from us. That might be an external customer outside of our organization, might also be somebody internal inside of our organization who's a customer of ours, or just somebody that we're delivering some value to. I had one group that one of its work item types was deployments, because there was actually a fair amount of work necessary to go through the deployment process. And so when they got requests from people, they needed to do some activities to do that deployment, and that was very much an internal activity within their organization, but it was a work item type because it was a different set of requesters with a different set of activities and a different deliverable at the end. Once I know my work item types, I'm just going to ask, what's the first thing that happens? So when a product backlog item shows up for the team, what's the first thing that happens to that product backlog item? And the team might say, well, we talk about it in refining. And then once it's refined, it's ready to go into the sprint. In sprint planning, we'll commit it to the sprint. Then we'll do the implementation. Then the product owner will accept it, and then we're done. Projects might have we have an intake activity for that. We talk through that. We understand what the needs are. We scope the product up. So really just having people talk about what's the first thing that you do when work item type A arrives, and then what happens. Once you understand the work and the workflow, it becomes really easy to set up a Kanban board. I have a backlog or an input queue, and then I have those and then what happens stages. So the work item types are flowing across the board. The workflow stages are things like analysis, development, testing, deployment. And then the final stage is typically something like released or done. And I really now have a visual representation of my work and how that work moves. So my litmus test when I'm doing Kanban board designs or system designs with teams is we step through all of these activities, and then I see, does this really make sense? Does this look like your work? Does this look like how you work? And as long as everybody nods their heads and says yes, then I know we've done a good job. If people are looking kind of at the board askance and saying, that's not really quite right, we just go back and talk through things a little bit more. But you ought to look at your Kanban board, and everybody on the team should nod their heads and say, that makes sense. That really is how we work. Once I have that board, then I want to go through setting up stage exit criteria. And what this is the criteria by which we know some stage in our workflow is done. How do we know analysis is done? How do you know development is done? We call analysis done once we have behavior-driven test cases are complete. We know there's no blocking external dependencies, and this team is story pointing. So they have story points of 8 points or less for a particular work item on their board. If you already have something like a definition of ready and a definition of done, you can harvest from those to build stage exit criteria. They're really a very similar concept. We're just coming at it from a slightly different perspective here, where things are a little bit more concrete per stage versus at Scrum, we're really looking at something about, can it enter the sprint yet, or can it exit the sprint yet? Here we're really looking at, okay, in each stage, what does it mean to be able to put something in the done column in that stage? Now we're ready to talk about work and process limits. And there's really only two that I use with teams. And I use one of them, individual WIP limiting, about 5 to 10% of the time. And I use full WIP limiting most of the time. Individual WIP limiting is just that. An individual person on your team has an individual limit of how much they can have on the board. Generally, people will say it's 2 per person. So each person can have 2 items in any stage on your Kanban board. I really don't like to use this because it focuses a lot on the individual and not on value flow. I will use it from time to time when there's work that is truly independent, where people can't help each other out at all. I used this once with a group who was a tools group supporting thousands of people across 4 different large product development efforts. And they had the one person who knew Jira, and that was the only person who knew Jira, and the one person who knew version 1, and that was the only person who knew version 1. So that was really, really highly independent work and solo work. And so at that point, we did use individual WIP limiting, but that's about the only time I'll ever use it. Really, I want to truly have full Kanban, true Kanban, which is full WIP limiting. And here what I'm doing is I'm saying how many items should we have in each of these stages? So how many things should we have in analysis in both the in process and the done column? So the WIP limit applies across both what we're working on and what's in done ready to be pulled through the system into the next stage. So you can see here in analysis, there is availability to pull something from the input queue into analysis and begin working on it because we only have 2 items there. That's under our WIP limit for bringing things in. And what we want to do with our WIP limits is optimize flow through the system. So we are looking to tune and tweak these in a way that has the fastest value delivery from the time that we start working on it until the time that it's done through the system. Some reasons to do this is the goal is really to have fast flow through the system, the continual movement of work item types. So you might have looked at some of these boards and thought, wow, those look a lot like something that's maybe very waterfall-y with a requirements phase and an analysis phase and a development phase and a testing phase. But if you actually put in place a whole project through this, you might have something that sat in requirements or analysis for 3 months. Well, that's the antithesis of fast continual movement of work items through the system. So we really, A, want to WIP limit, and B, want to talk about what size of work item is flowing through this board, because the goal is to have things continuously moving and value continuously being delivered out of the Kanban system. And we approximate that flow by using that pull system and then also by that continual reduction in batch sizes. So I had an organization once that wanted to move to Kanban, and what they were really delivering at that time was projects, but within projects was features. So our first step was to say, we're not going to Kanban a project because that's going to sit in these stages for a long time. But instead, let's Kanban the feature delivery work that's happening within this project that 150 people were contributing to. So that allowed us to look at a smaller batch size and to get a better sense of what flow was actually really happening there. We want to minimize work in process so that things move quickly. I don't know how many times I've sat down with organizations and we set up their Kanban board, we set up the system, we start talking about it, we start talking about WIP limits. Most teams will say, you know, it's probably not reasonable to have people working on more than 2 things at any one time. So if you had a team of 8, that's probably something like 16-ish items on a Kanban board. But then we take the work and we populate it on the board and they've got 32 items. So they're working on a ton of stuff. And you can imagine if we're working on a ton of stuff, no one thing is being moved through that system very fast. So people will talk a lot about stop starting, start finishing, rather than working on too many things where nothing really moves very quickly through the system. Let's work on a smaller set of things. Let's minimize our work in process so that we can then deliver that much more quickly. An ideal WIP limit would be 1x per stage resource, but I find in general most teams are in that it should be 16 or less. But we really have 20 or 30 or 40 things we're trying to do. So a lot of times I'll start teams at let's just rationalize and get it down to 2x per stage resource. So a team of 5 should have about 10 things as a starting point. And then we'll begin to collect some of the metrics that I'll share with you soon. And we want to basically optimize the WIP limits to optimize the value delivery, the cycle time, through our system. And we'll find that as you move from 2x closer and closer to 1x, you'll actually see the cycle time reductions happening as you reduce those WIP limits. Now, obviously, at a certain point, you can crank the WIP limits down to the point where the throughput of the system decreases, but the data will show you that, and I guarantee you there are gains to be had by reducing down from 2x closer and closer to 1x per stage resource in your system. So now we've set up a basic Kanban system. We have what Kanban will call a standard class of service in place. Standard class of service is typically a first in, first out class of service. So as we're looking to move something across the board, we look for the oldest thing in the stage ahead of us, and we pull that into our stage to work on. But not all work is created equal in a lot of organizations. So teams will often tell me things like, well, yes, we work on our product backlog, but we also have some amount of urgent production support that we need to handle. Well, that tells me that there's two classes of service here. There's one that is a standard class of service, the work we do day in, day out, and then there's a much more urgent class of service that exists in this system. And a lot of teams will have the idea of a standard class of service and then an expedite class of service. And that's the stuff that comes screaming in, hair on fire, can't wait. Policies are really important to set here. I joke with a lot of groups that if you let things that aren't truly expedite come in, you'll start expediting everything, which means you're expediting nothing. And so we really do want to sit down and say, what does it mean for us to allow something to be expedite? And here I'll use the idea of a Kanban board policy where we say the expedite lane, for example, with one of the groups I worked with was if it was a priority 1, severity 1, SLA customer issue, it went into expedite. They also said if so-and-so in our organization, so if Joe Smith, senior executive, comes in and tells us we must do it, we must do it. And so their policy was S1, P1, SLA defect, or Joe Smith told us we have to do it. But they also said we'll only expedite one thing at a time. Another group I worked with had the idea of they had 2 managers in their organization. They had Joe and Joe. So for anything to go through the expedite lane, Joe squared had to agree. Both of the Joes had to agree, and then it would go into the expedite lane. That group went from expediting several things a week to expediting one thing a month just by putting a policy around what was allowed to actually have that level of class of service. What did it mean for something to be that special it could do the expedite lane? So if you do have to have an expedite lane, you need an expedite lane, but recognize that having any other class of service will slow down standard delivery. So having an expedite lane is somewhat disruptive. We'll often talk about, is that really an expedite lane, or do you really just have a high priority lane where certain things are more important and need to work through the system faster, but they're not as disruptive as an expedite. An expedite literally means it can suspend your work in progress process limits, and it can exceed your WIP limits. So you need to stop what you're working on in standard and move to the expedite right now as soon as it arrives. High priority just means it takes precedence over other work. So I always tell people the first thing to do before introducing any classes of service is to see, can you just order your backlog, your input queue? Is that enough? There's always the opportunity to order that input queue to make sure that the next thing that goes into the system is the most important thing. And so we really do need to make sure that we're using our classes of service thoughtfully. When you need them, you need them. But I've definitely been in organizations where we didn't start by having a class of service. We just started by saying, hey, let's just order the input queue and let's see what happens there. Maybe that's enough and we really don't need a class of service. So think of this as a Kanban tool in the toolbox to use if you need to and how you need to, but isn't something that necessarily every Kanban implementation has. So this is an example of a board showing you the expedite lane. It's the ticket is in silver because sometimes people will call this a silver bullet. So you can see we've got our normal work flowing, and then we have the opportunity for an expedite, should we need an expedite if something comes in that's so important that meets our policy for expediting across our board. So now we have our Kanban system set up. What we're going to do now is start to operate our Kanban system on a day-to-day basis. So things like, what's a daily Kanban look like? What kind of metrics are we going to be gathering? That's all part of this. So yes, many teams will have daily Kanbans, but they do look a little bit different because the purpose is a little bit different. The purpose is a focus on maintaining flow. So we're really going to be looking at the things that interrupt flow. Do we have something that's blocking, something that's not moving across the system because maybe there's information we need or dependencies we need or a deliverable we expected from another team? Because obviously if something is blocked, it's not flowing across the board as we expected. Once we have things like cycle time and lead time, we'll also want to talk about anything that might not meet our service level agreement. So once we understand our system and can predict its delivery, we'll want to talk about anything that looks abnormal for the expected delivery cadence, and then any other concerns or issues that come up that people want to talk about. So the idea of walking the Kanban board, we will literally start at the done column of the Kanban board and then walk our way towards the backlog or the input queue, pausing in each stage and talking about things. Is there something blocked in the deployment process that we need to do? Is there something in validation that's taking longer than we expected for some reason and looks like it might not come out when we expected it to, and what are we going to do about that? Is there some concern or challenge or question somebody has, an implementation that they want to discuss? Okay, design looks great. Okay, we're done. I've seen teams of 25, 30 people do a daily Kanban in 15 minutes because we're really looking at the exceptions to our flow rather than just what is happening in these stages. We're looking for things that aren't moving the way that we expect them to move inside of our system. One of the things about Kanban is the input queue and how you manage it is really up to you. You need to decide the way that you're going to order or prioritize that input queue. And a common pattern is having something like an individual person, a product owner, an engineering manager, a tech lead, who owns the ordering of that input queue or that product backlog. Another really common pattern is having a group of people who meets on a regular basis. They need to replenish. It's called a queue replenishment meeting, and these happen as frequently as you need them to make sure that the queue has enough for the next working period. So they might meet every week. They might meet a couple times a week. They might meet twice a month. It really depends on how often that queue needs to be replenished. And in this meeting, you'll have everybody who has an interested stake in what's going to be done by that team's backlog over the next, say, 1 week, really working together to prioritize that input queue and get agreement about which items should be where in the input queue so that they'll be delivered over that next period of time. The concept here is that you really want the input queue to be the place where items are reprioritized or removed rather than the items that are inside the Kanban board. So conceptually, once something is pulled from the backlog or the input queue and work is begun on it, it either needs to be finished or it needs to be completely dropped. We're not going to reprioritize items once they're in flight. And I have seen organizations who will actually have a stage or a status or a physical representation of anything that gets dropped or gets removed once it's in flight. Some people will have a little trash can so you can actually see how many things did we start working on that ended up going in the trash, because that's just wasted effort. And so teams where they think that might happen to them a lot, we find a way of making sure that's really clear to people so that we understand what kind of waste is happening in our system. Because the concept here should be that once we start that work, we're going to finish that work. Anything else is disruptive to value delivery through the system. So let's talk a little bit about Kanban metrics. Kanban teams generally will look at cumulative flow diagrams, they'll look at cycle time, and they'll look at lead time. And using things like cycle time and lead time, they can set up a service level agreement, an SLA, and really help people understand what should you expect from a delivery cadence from this Kanban team. So cycle time is the time from the moment we begin work on something. So we begin work when it moves from the backlog into design, the clock starts. The clock ends when it moves from the deployment column into done. So this may be in days. It may potentially be in weeks, hopefully not. It really shouldn't be longer than that. It may be in hours. So what's the time from the time we touch it for the first time, really working on it, until it's done? That's our cycle time. We also may want lead time, and lead time is cycle time plus how long did it spend in the backlog or the input queue. So lead time is our cycle time plus time that it spent waiting from the moment that somebody initially asked for it. And so collecting these, you would timestamp it when it entered the backlog, you would timestamp it when it enters into design, and you'd timestamp it when it was done. And then you could collect both cycle time and lead time data for that work item. And then people are generally looking at things like average cycle time and lead time, but we'll also talk about looking at the distribution of that information to understand how predictable your system really is. A big thing that people will look at is cumulative flow diagrams, which give you a sense for how the work is moving over time. Many of the tools now have cumulative flow diagrams. It can actually be an interesting thing to look at your cumulative flow diagram as a Scrum team for a sprint, because what we're really looking for here is smooth, consistent flow. So if you go look at a cumulative flow diagram and you see a lot of long flat spots, that tells you that work isn't moving very well through your system. And so you're looking for things here like the relationship between how much work is happening and what's the cycle time look. And you'll often see this with brand new teams. They'll start out and there's a ton of work in process and cycle time is quite long. And as they move down to that 2x per stage, you'll actually see the work in process shrinking and the cycle time reducing. And then as they move even from 2x closer and closer to 1x, you'll continue to see that reduction until they reach a point where you actually see it go the other direction. So that's a lot of what teams will do initially when they first set up their Kanban systems, is start to look at the cumulative flow diagram to help them really get that information about, yes, changing how much work in process we have is actually improving our cycle time and or our cycle and lead time, to really validate that what they expect to be happening is happening. A lot of the tools will give you average cycle time, and average cycle time can be really interesting. It can also be pretty misleading. If I have something that shows an average cycle time of 9 days, but what I'm really seeing is something that looks much more unpredictable or inconsistent. So for example, we have 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, 6. And maybe there's a whole bunch over here at 20 and 23. We want to start looking at cycle time distribution. I may well have, a fair amount of things that cause me to have an average cycle time that looks like it's around 9, but then I'll actually see that there's a whole bunch, a little spike over here of really big things. So, well, why is it 9? Well, it's 9 because we've got a lot of stuff that's at, 6 days and 7 days and 8 days, but there's also this whole chunk of work over here that's usually taking 20 days to get through the system. Well, what's going on with that? And at that point, we probably have 2 relatively different sizes of work. We have some work that's pretty small and flows pretty quickly, and we have some work that's pretty big. And we'll actually want to rationalize that on our Kanban board in some way. One way to do that would be to have 2 swim lanes, one for smaller work and one for bigger work. Another way to do it would actually be to do some sizing, some t-shirt sizing or story pointing, or something kind of earlier in the Kanban board to help rationalize the work, to maybe take these and decompose it into smaller work items that look more like this cluster of size. So we want to understand not just what the average looks like, because the average can be somewhat misleading. We want to understand really what the distribution looks like, because that will help us truly understand what the work, what the delivery looks like, and what a service level agreement for the system could look like. And what we're looking at here is probably the nicest, cleanest cycle time distribution you'll ever see, with a nice steep peak right in the middle and a long, long tail off towards the end. I have certainly worked with teams where initial cycle time distribution looks a lot messier, right? We've got something where it's kind of all over the map. And it's really unclear and really inconsistent, right? So if I have a cycle time distribution that looks something like this, that really tells me I don't understand what's going on with my system yet. We really need to start understanding the work in a lot more detail. We need to start understanding why the work is all over the map and inconsistent. We want to start moving towards something that looks more like a smooth, consistent flow with some obvious peaks in the area to help us really then be able to say, what's our SLA, right? So here we're looking at, most likely people would say this system delivers in 60 days or less 85% of the time. And it does, very much so. There's a few things that have this tail end. Most people won't worry about trying to get to the 98th percentile, but there will be things that go above 60 days for some reason. Long blocks inside the system's a really common issue. Maybe you start working on something and find a big external dependency. It takes you 3 weeks to get that dependency resolved with another team. Now you're looking at something that's outside of the norm. So those are big metrics for teams to look at. Looking at cycle time, looking at its distribution. Many people will also look at lead time, so understand not just how long does it take from the time we start, but also how long does it take from the time we start, from the time that it was ordered and then we started it, to understand the predictability of the system. Sometimes people will say to me, can Scrum and Kanban coexist? And the answer in my mind is always absolutely. In fact, in my recommendation is you shouldn't be saying, is it an either or question? You should be saying, where Scrum, where Kanban? There's a ton of value in having a work mix in many organizations where some of the teams are using Scrum, other teams are using Kanban. I stand up a lot of organizations where the product development teams are using Scrum. They have 2-week sprints. They're syncing those sprints. But then there's other teams who are doing things that really need to be much more responsive in support of those teams. Maybe a DevOps pipeline team, an automation team, an infrastructure team, teams that need to be able to deliver things those Scrum teams need. To predictably deliver on their sprint commitments. They want to be much more responsive. So it's Scrum in most places, but Kanban in selected others based on the type of work they're doing or their responsive need. I love the pattern of Kanban above Scrum teams. So having a set of 5 teams, 10 teams, 50 teams, 150 teams, and then really modeling what the overall project, program, portfolio looks like above all of those teams. So I understand the flow of value delivery from talking about the idea to then allocating out to Scrum teams, to bringing that all together across all of the teams and validating that a major feature or a major epic or major capability is really working and working the way that we expect it. So I think that's a really sweet spot for Kanban to help model and understand that overall flow of value across a whole group of Scrum teams or across a whole group of Kanban teams. And then using Kanban within Scrum teams. You can Kanban the workflow of Scrum. I like to talk about that as a way to make a good Scrum team great. I like a team to have some really good basic Scrum underneath their belt. And then we're going to start talking about things like cycle time and lead time and better visualization of their overall workflow to help them really optimize value before, during, and after the individual sprint activities that Scrum is really thinking about most. Sometimes people will also talk about Scrum Bond. So Scrum Bond was initially designed as a transition path from moving from Scrum to Kanban. It's broadly used today when people really want to introduce Kanban into their Scrum implementation. So thinking about things like what kind of WIP limits will help us optimize our velocity or optimize our cycle time or both. And there's some variations in Scrum Bond. So I've seen people who it looks more like Scrum. They're still doing Scrum events. They're still doing fixed iterations. And I've seen some teams where it looks a lot more like Kanban. They really transition away from the Scrum events per se and into something that's much more flow-based. So in my mind, Scrum Bond nowadays in the real world is just kind of a term that covers a lot of territory for something that looks and feels a lot more like Scrum to something that looks and feels a lot more like Kanban. So let's go back to our myths and misconceptions. So Kanban is just a board. Well, I hope that you see that Kanban should be much more than that. It really shouldn't look like a to-do and process and done kind of board. You should really look at your Kanban board and know that that is your work and that's your workflow. One of the things I always look for is there an in progress stage inside of a Kanban board? Well, in progress isn't really something we're doing with the work and on the work. So that means something isn't quite right in our Kanban board. What are we actually really doing there? What's the activity that we're doing on the work? And know that it's not just about having that board. That's shallow Kanban. You really want to optimize the value delivery by limiting your work in process. You want to make clear what it means for something to be done by using stage exit criteria. So there's so much more value left on the table if you just think about it as a board and only a board. Kanban's just Scrum without iterations. Kanban should provide you a deeper model of the work. You can do Scrum Bond where you do still have iterations. You could be doing Kanban where there was never any Scrum in there at all, and there are no such things as iterations, but it doesn't look anything like Scrum. You're not having a sprint planning meeting. There's no sprint commitment to it. You're really just saying, what's the next work item type that we need to work on? And you're pulling from an input queue as soon as there's availability in your system, but you're deeply understanding the work and the flow and the data that you're collecting about that work. There is no estimation in Kanban. Well, I hope you see that Kanban is awfully flexible. If you need to estimate, then you estimate. Generally, what people will do is capture stage exit criteria that talk about that something has been estimated or estimated to be a certain size or lower. I've seen teams where the input queue or the backlog has to enter into the system, those items need to have been t-shirt sized, a medium or less. And then we have an analysis phase, and in that analysis phase, we story point it. I've even had Kanban teams that I've stood up that are doing Kanban, but reporting data like velocity because the organization expects velocity data to be available and a reported metric from the team. So if you need to estimate in Kanban, you should. You just add it into your board as activities and stage exit criteria to make sure that's part of your specific process. But again, there's no specific thing inside of Kanban saying you're going to do it. That's a choice you'll make as part of implementing your Kanban board, your Kanban system. You either use Scrum or you use Kanban. It's not an either or question. To me, it's really about where does Kanban fit and where does Scrum fit and how do we use these two in collaboration for something that's more powerful to us than maybe each individual one alone could be. And last, Kanban is too complex. Well, Kanban is significantly less prescriptive than Scrum. I tell people all the time, one of the really nice things about Scrum is it comes with a cookbook. You can go to the Scrum guide, it gives you roles, it gives you events, it gives you artifacts. That's a great starter kit. You're going to get a nice recipe out of it. You may want to add a little cumin or cayenne or coriander or something that makes it taste a little better to you, but you get a recipe. With Kanban, you're going to need to build your own recipe from scratch. You need to figure out your work item types, what kind of WIP limits you're using. So yes, it's a little more complicated, but it's not rocket science to set this up. It's a rational, reasonable set of activities that you need to go to, a set of decisions that you need to make, and then you really have built a recipe that is perfect for what you're trying to do with your team and in your organization. So Kanban has a lot more flexibility to it. You do need to be thoughtful in your implementation. I always tell people we need to be disciplined, and so I really want to go through those steps to get to deep Kanban. I don't want to just stop at a board that visualizes it. Then we really have left all the value of Kanban on the table from my perspective. We need to go through that thought process. But it's not like it's not a thought process that people can learn. They can become very comfortable at. They can do relatively easy and quickly with a small amount of experience in helping teams set up Kanban systems. Earl, are there any questions?
Hi, Jenny. This is Earl here. Yeah, there are lots of good questions here. One of them I couldn't answer. I've been answering a lot of them for you behind the scenes, but one of them is free Kanban tools. I'm always aware of the tools that are built into like Jira or Azure DevOps. Have you been seeing anybody playing with a free Kanban-based web tool?
Off the top of my head, most of the tools that I know are for a fee, but I know there's a lot of whiteboarding tools that have been coming up lately. And a lot of those whiteboarding tools have templates in them, and those templates really look like you could set up Kanban boards.
Right,
so
but you wouldn't do the metrics with those probably.
No, you'd need to do, I mean, the nice thing about the tools that you actually pay for is you get a lot more richness and robustness in what those tools will give you. If you're using something that's kind of free off the web, you're going to need to do a lot of the heavy, well, it's not heavy lifting, it's not that hard. You need to timestamp 3 times to get both cycle time and lead time, but you would need to do that.
Excel will do the rest for you.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Interesting question. What about the Q&A period where things go into test and debug and then they're not really fixed? Do you see that? Do you want to model that as multiple steps, or you just have things sit in the test and debug stage until they're finally really done?
I'd want them to sit in the test and debug stage until they're finally done, because that's the primary activity that we're doing. We've already built it. We thought we knew what it was, we built it, now we're trying to really validate and ensure it works the way that we thought it works. So that's really a testing or validation activity. So I'd want it to stay in that stage. I have seen a number of teams, when they think about their WIP limits, they may say, we have 10 to spend, and we have maybe 3 developers and 2 testers, but the WIP limits on dev and test end up looking the same because some percentage of development time is spent in the testing phase to do fixes and help debugging, maybe help with automation and do other activities. So that might shift the WIP limits, but in general, we don't see work moving backwards on a Kanban board.
Or you just model out 8 steps of debug, defix, then debug and defix and bug and test and see if you can skip any of them.
Yeah, well, I always tell people in setting up a Kanban board, my recommendation is to keep it simple. I'm usually looking for 3 at the smallest generally in a workflow step, no more than about 5. If you've got more than 5, I think you've made it too complicated to start.
Excellent. Another good question is a Kanban team of 1, right? So the team is 1, but they have lots of different inputs. Would you model those typically as different classes of services, the different teams inputting, or would you actually want to have a different Kanban board for every different person who's asking for this resource?
Just like in Scrum, we talk about one team, one board. In Kanban, I'd want to see one person, one board. Um, you could potentially have a bunch of swim lanes, but honestly, if it was one person with a whole bunch of people asking me for stuff, I would just want a really simple board with one input queue, because I'm either going to need somebody to prioritize that for me, or I'm going to need to do a queue replenishment meeting where we sit down with a whole bunch of people and say, well, of all the stuff that I could do, what do we want me doing? Because I need alignment across those stakeholders of what the prioritization of the work I should be doing is. And with one person, a lot of people will talk about personal Kanban. Personal Kanban, I'm comfortable with personal Kanban just being a really simple board to start with to do and process and done because it's just one person. I don't do that when I'm talking about team Kanban. But if you are just a simple person with a bunch of stakeholders, you might start off with a really simple board and just one input queue to help you align the needs of all those diverse stakeholders into a single prioritized queue for you, then run that for a while and let the board evolve complexity as you need.
Right. Another really interesting question that came in is who usually looks at this? All the team. And I think the question here is obviously this is interesting for management to walk by and see what the status of work is. And I'm not sure if you spoke to it in your talk, but isn't there an aspect of the Kanban as, hey, here's how the team walks this board, sees where the bottleneck is, and figure out how to maximize their through flow?
I always say if the team feels like the board is just a management tool, we've done something wrong in the Kanban system design. So we need to step back with the team and say, what is it about this board that is causing you to not find it valuable, not find it useful, not think it's a view of your work? Because quite literally, the board should be the place that people go every day to understand what's happening. They should feel like those metrics provide them useful information to optimize value flow. And it's the place I go every day to figure out what I should do. If I've finished something, I go to the board and the board will tell me what to pick up next. I don't need to go talk to some other individual to know that. The board has everything I need for me to know what I should be doing. And so it should feel like something that is useful, necessary, and valuable to the individuals on the team.
Right. Now, let's say I have a board and I have multiple classes of services because I decided to break up different inputs into classes of service. Do I do the metrics on each class of service individually, or do I do the metrics on the entire flow?
I would do the metrics on the individual classes of service. And I would say if you only have two classes of service, a standard and a high priority, or a standard and an expedite, that's just fine. That's, in fact, usually I'm trying to, one's good, two's okay, three makes me nervous. And if you're going to have more than three, the only one you get to add into the board is the low priority or intangible class of service, which is the one where work flows through that has no SLA. We can pick it up and put it down as we need, because we need that to give the board flexibility.
Okay. How about once an item enters in standard class, could it change to a high priority class or expedited class while it's in flight, or does it has to stay the same class once it goes in?
No, you'll see, especially if you have like a high priority class of service, if you've got something flowing through standard, but it looks at risk of meeting the SLA that you have established for that, it could shift to a higher class of service.
You ever see it shifting down?
Into a lower class? No. that would worry me. I'd want to understand what was happening there. Why did it end up in standard anyway if it really isn't standard? Why wasn't it in the low priority or intangible?
Right. And one final question, since we're almost out of time here. The last question is, let's say that you're looking at your flow times. Have you ever tried to align flow times with like classes of input? So you're just like, oh, we can look at this input item. It looks like a medium item, so it usually amounts to this spike in our flow time. Or in this item, looks like a large item. It usually aligns to this spike in our flow time distribution that you were talking about. Have you ever done that kind of thing? Rather than just using velocity or story points, which kind of gives us that sense. This one gives us a sense of, this one looks like it's this kind of flow time?
So usually we'll try and either make the work more consistent in size by estimating it and bringing a more rationalization around what's allowed to be inside the system so it's more consistent, or I'll break it into swim lanes by size type. So large items, medium items, small items may be flowing across that board. Did that answer the question, Earl?
Yeah, I think so. Basically, so you would see, if you looked at the flow, then you would have the metrics per that size type.
Yes, that's right.
So
that's right.
We're still estimating them into size types beforehand and then putting in the flow.
Yep.
Okay. Well, we're up to our hour here, so we're going to stop the questions there. And just, I think you have a final slide where they can write us if they want to ask more questions.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. We're available. You can reach out to me at jenny.stewart@construx.com or generically at hello@construx.com. These materials will be available in our on-demand ecosystem for free access afterwards as well.
So excellent. Well, I'm done here. And so with that, I'll let you sign off, Jenny.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful rest of your day.